This is the international news on Atlantic Television Network. First, the headlines. From Kenya, protesters vow to keep up demonstrations, new tax hikes. North Korea, hypersonic missile undergoes test fires, explodes mid-air. Netherlands, Mark Rutte, fierce Putin critic confirmed as next NATO leader. United States, spacecraft, 2 astronauts on board, stuck in space. Australia, Assange reunites with family after plea deal. Now the news in details. Kenyan protesters vowed on Wednesday to keep up their demonstrations against new tax hikes, a day after police opened fire on crowds trying to storm parliament, leaving at least 8 people dead and scores wounded. As heavily armed officers patrolled the streets of the capital Nairobi, supporters of the week-old protest movement took to X using the hashtag to 10 Thursday or See You on Thursday in a mix of Swahili and English. An online outpouring of anger over tax increases has swelled into a nationwide protest movement calling for a political overhaul in the most serious crisis of President William Ruto's 2-year-old presidency. Many social media users focused on Ruto's speech after the clashes, in which he said the attack on Parliament was the work of criminals pretending to be peaceful protesters. Good morning, fellow criminals. To Patani Thursday to do what criminals do, one ex-user posted. Nairobi's main public mortuary received the bodies of 6 people killed in Tuesday's protest, a police officer posted there said. Another 2 bodies and 160 people with injuries came into the Kenyatta National Hospital, 2 health officials said. Ruto said in his televised address to the nation late on Tuesday that the debate about the tax measures, which lawmakers passed minutes before Parliament was breached, had been hijacked by dangerous people. The government ordered the army deployed to help the police deal with a security emergency, though there were no reports of troops on the streets of Nairobi on Wednesday. Last week, protesters had circulated a schedule that called for the occupation of Parliament on Tuesday and the occupation of State House, the President's office, and residence on Thursday. Protester Wellington Ogala said he would head back out onto the streets. It is our right to demonstrate. We are just expressing ourselves, he said as he walked through downtown Nairobi, where the smell of tear gas lingered in the air. Lawmakers removed some tax hikes from the final version of the finance bill, including ones on bread and cooking oil, but inserted others in an effort to avoid a budget gap. Protesters say they want the whole bill scrapped, and many are now demanding that Ruto resign. He won election almost 2 years ago on a platform of championing Kenya's working poor, but has been caught between the competing demands of lenders such as the International Monetary Fund, which is urging the government to cut deficits to obtain more funding, and a hard-pressed population. A dangerous strain of mpox that is killing children and causing miscarriages in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is the most transmissible yet and could spread internationally, scientists have warned. The virus appears to be spreading from person to person via both sexual and non-sexual contact, in places ranging from brothels to schools. Hundreds of people with the disease, formerly known as monkeypox, have attended hospital in the mining town of Kimituga Kamituga, South Kivu province, in what is likely to be the tip of the iceberg of a larger outbreak, doctors say. Mpox is a virus from the same family as smallpox and causes flu-like symptoms and pus-filled lesions. 2 years ago, an outbreak in Europe and the US that centered on the gay community prompted the World Health Organization to declare a public health emergency. It was the first time Mpox had been reported to have spread via sexual contact. That outbreak was caused by a clade 2 of the virus, one of 3 recognized groupings of Mpox and one that has a relatively low death rate. The new DRC outbreak is a mutated form of clade 1 Mpox. Doctors report a fatality rate of about 5% in adults and 10% in children, as well as high rates of miscarriages among pregnant women. Clade 1 has historically been found in people who eat infected bushmeats, with transmission largely confined to the affected household. Researchers believe the current outbreak began in a bar used by sex workers. At a briefing for journalists, Trudy Lang, professor of global health research at Oxford University, said that when the DRC outbreak was detected last September, scientists had assumed it would be clade 2 because of the sexual transmission, until genetic testing revealed it belonged to the more virulent strain. South Korean authorities ordered a halt on Wednesday to the operations of a manufacturer of lithium batteries after a fire killed 23 people as they investigate 3 company officials for suspected safety violations. Monday's fire at unlisted battery maker RSL was one of the deadliest industrial accidents of recent years. Dozens of South Korean workers lose their lives on the job each year, despite tougher laws and measures to improve safety. The company, in the industrial hub of Hwaesong, southwest of Seoul, the capital, was told to shut its only factory for inspection. Min Gil-soo, an official of the Labor Ministry, told the briefing. Police raided the company's offices on Wednesday, the Yonhap news agency said. Authorities did not identify the company officials being investigated, however. Safety code violations can lead to jail terms for fatal accidents. RSL Chief Executive Park Sun-kwan apologized on Tuesday for the fire, but said the company had followed all safety regulations and training requirements. Flames quickly engulfed the factory, where 35,000 lithium batteries were stored, and the spread of toxic smoke probably rendered workers unconscious within seconds, fire officials have said. Only 3 of the dead, all of them South Korean men, have been identified. The rest, including 17 Chinese, have yet to be identified as their bodies suffered severe damage in the fire. Investigators are trying to determine the cause of the blaze amid questions about RSL's hiring of foreign workers on a temporary basis and whether they received adequate safety training. The office of a lawmaker, Kim Sung-hoi, provided a copy of a March inspection report by the Hwaesong Fire Department that showed it had flagged serious risks, including possible rapid combustion at the building where the fire broke out. The fire department was not available for comment. Set up in 2020, RSL has 48 full-time employees and makes lithium primary batteries for sensors and radio communication devices. It also supplies batteries to the military for use in some communication and crypto devices, a spokesperson for South Korea's Defense Procurement Agency said. The agency's annual safety inspections cover suppliers in some categories, such as firearms and chemicals, but exclude battery makers such as RSL, the spokesperson said. North Korea test-fired what appeared to be a hypersonic missile off its east coast on Wednesday, but it exploded in mid-air, South Korea's military said. The missile was launched from near the capital, Pyongyang, South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff said. Japan's defense ministry said the missile flew to an altitude of about 100 kilometers and range of more than 200 kilometers. Senior officials of South Korea, the United States, and Japan held a phone call and condemned the launch as a violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and a serious threat to the peace and stability of the region and beyond. South Korean and U.S. Air Forces said they conducted joint exercises involving F-22 and F-35 stealth fighter As part of their annual Buddy Squadron training, South Korea's Marine Corps staged separate firing drills near the maritime border with the North for the first time since Seoul scrapped an inter-Korean military pact early this month. The drills were announced earlier in June. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command also issued a condemnation and called on Pyongyang to refrain from further unlawful and destabilizing acts. While we have assessed that this event does not pose an immediate threat to U.S. personnel or our territory or to our allies, we continue to monitor the situation, it said in a statement. North Korea's last missile launch was on May 30th. North Korea this week criticized the deployment of a U.S. aircraft carrier to joint drills with South Korea and Japan and warned of an overwhelming new demonstration of deterrence. The missile launch comes a day after the 74-year anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. Last week, North Korea leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a summit and signed a mutual defense pact. Tokyo criticized the two countries' deepening military cooperation, with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol calling the pact anachronistic. North Korean state media said on Wednesday a mass rally in Pyongyang was held to commemorate the war anniversary, calling it a day of struggle against U.S. imperialism and calling the United States the arch-enemy. Recently, North Korea has flown hundreds of balloons carrying trash towards the south, including on Tuesday, while Pyongyang deployed a large group of soldiers to build new fortifications within the heavily armed border between the two Koreas, according to the South military, occasionally drawing warning shots from South Korean counterparts. Taiwan's defense ministry said on Wednesday that China had carried out another joint combat readiness patrol near the island, as Beijing said it would track down and punish die-hard independent supporters wherever they are. China, which views democratically governed Taiwan as its own territory, has made no secret of its dislike of President Lai Ching-te, whom it views as a separatist, and staged 2 days of war games after he took office last month. Last week, China threatened to execute die-hard Taiwan independent separatists in extreme cases, a further ramping up of tensions that drew condemnation from Lai and his government, as well as the United States. Taiwan's defense ministry said that starting at 7 a.m. on Wednesday, it had detected 26 Chinese military aircraft, including J-16 fighters, operating to the north, center, and south of Taiwan, carrying out a joint combat readiness patrol with Chinese warships. Taiwan frequently reports such missions, part of a pattern of what it says is Chinese harassment that has escalated in the past 4 years. China's defense ministry did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Speaking at a regular news briefing in Beijing, a spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office said the government had the legal right to protect the country's territorial integrity, defending last week's new guidelines to punish what Beijing views as separatism. National law enforcement and judicial organs will pursue all Taiwan independence diehards who test the law to the end, no matter where they are, and severely punish them in accordance with the law. Zhu Fenglian told reporters. China will enforce precision punishment, but the guidelines do not involve the majority of Taiwanese people, she added. The state punishes the crimes of secession and incitement to secession by Taiwan independence diehards in accordance with the law. There is a solid legal foundation and sufficient legal basis for this, Zhu said. Chinese courts have no jurisdiction in Taiwan, and it is not clear how China could seek to enforce any judgments outside its borders. Lai has repeatedly offered talks with China but been rebuffed. He rejects Beijing's sovereignty claims and says only Taiwan's people can decide their future. Takeoffs and landings at South Korea's Incheon International Airport were disrupted on Wednesday for about 3 hours before dawn because of balloons launched by North Korea filled with refuse, an airport spokesperson said. One balloon landed on the tarmac near Passenger Terminal 2, and the 3 runways at Incheon were temporarily shut down, the spokesperson said. North Korea has flown balloons carrying trash into South Korea since late May, with hundreds landing in South Korea. Several balloons were spotted in and around the airport boundaries, the spokesperson said, adding that this was not the first time operations at the airport, which is about 40 kilometers from the North Korean border, had been disrupted by balloons nearby. The disruption to domestic and international flights occurred between 1:46 a.m. and 4:44 a.m. and the runways have reopened since then, Incheon International Airport Corporation said. Flight volume at that time of day is usually low. Flight Radar 24 shows 8 arriving cargo and passenger flights were diverted to South Korea's Cheongju or Jeju airports during that time, and one China cargo freighter from Shanghai was diverted to Yantai, China. Several more landings were delayed and departures were delayed by several hours. North Korea has said the balloons are a retaliation for a propaganda campaign by North Korean defectors and activists in the South who regularly send over balloons carrying food, medicine, money and leaflets criticizing the North's leaders. Among the items carried by the North Korean balloons have been articles printed with Hello Kitty characters, badly worn clothing, and soil containing traces of human feces and parasites. South Korea has said. South Korea's military on Wednesday said about 100 balloons had fallen to the ground between Tuesday and Wednesday, mostly in the capital Seoul and the surrounding Gyeonggi province. Most have carried just scraps of paper. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi passed the first big political test of his third term on Wednesday as a candidate from the ruling coalition was elected Speaker of the lower house of Parliament, defeating an opposition lawmaker. Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party is having to rely on allies to run the government for the first time in a decade, while the opposition did much better than expected in a bitterly fought national election that ended this month. The Speaker's post was contested instead of being chosen by consensus, as is the usual practice. The BJP's Om Birla, who was Speaker in the last term of the House too, beat K. Sharash from the opposition Congress by estimating the volume of members shouting their assent or opposition. The BJP-led National Democratic Alliance has 293 lawmakers in the lower house, known as the Lok Sabha, 21 more than the required majority of 272. Congress spokesperson Jairam Ramesh said opposition parties did not insist on a formal vote and agreed to the voice vote because they wanted a spirit of consensus and cooperation to prevail. Congress leader Rahul Gandhi, who was declared the leader of the opposition late on Tuesday by his party, accompanied Modi as they congratulated Birla on his election, a rare show of harmony between the two bitter rivals. This is the first time that Gandhi, 54, the scion of the Nehru-Gandhi family, will assume a statutory role in parliament that gives him the status of a cabinet member. It's very important that the voice of the opposition is allowed to be represented in his house, Gandhi said in his speech, while congratulating Birla. Of course, the government has political power, but the opposition also represents the voice of India's people, and this time the opposition represents significantly more voice of the Indian people than it did last time. The Speaker, who conducts business in the decision-making lower house and presides over it, is critical to the passage of laws. Israeli forces pounded several areas across Gaza on Wednesday, and residents reported fierce fighting overnight in Rafah in the south of Palestinian enclave. Residents said fighting intensified in the Tel al-Sultan neighborhood in western Rafah, where tanks were also trying to force their way north amid heavy clashes. The armed wings of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad said fighters attacked each tank rockets and mortar bombs. Since early May, ground fighting has focused on Rafah, abutting Egypt on Gaza's southern edge, where around half of 6 million people had been sheltering after fleeing other areas. Most have since had to flee again. Medics said 2 Palestinians killed in one Israeli missile strike in Rafah earlier on Wednesday. The Israeli military said in a statement its forces killed a Hamas militant who had been involved in the smuggling of weapons through the border between Rafah and Egypt. The jets struck the targets in Rafah overnight, including fighters, military structures, and tunnel shafts. northern Gaza town of Beit Lahia, an Israeli airstrike destroyed a house, killing 4 Palestinians and wounding several others, medics said. Israel's ground attack in Gaza was triggered when Hamas-led militants stormed into southern Israel on October 7, killing around 1,200 people and seizing more than 200 tallies. The Israeli offensive in retaliation has so far 30,658 people, the Gaza Ministry said on Tuesday, and has left the tiny, heavily built-up Gaza Strip in ruins. More than 8 months into the war, international mediation backed by the U.S. has failed to yield a ceasefire agreement. Hamas says any deal must bring an end to the war and full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. As hearing a UN from which heroin the Taliban opium production who fear a revival of protests that have erupted periodically by lower and middle income communities angry at enduring hardship. The reinstatement of U.S. sanctions in 2018 hit Iran's oil exports, slashing government revenues and forcing it to take unpopular steps, such as increasing taxes and running big budget deficits, policies that have kept annual inflation close to 40%. Although the country has avoided a total economic meltdown, thanks mainly to oil exports to China and higher crude prices, petroleum exports are still below their pre-2018 levels. Most candidates seeking to replace Ibrahim Raisi following his death in a helicopter crash last month say they plan to emulate his policy of economic self-reliance and more businesses ties to Asia. Others have defended broader relations with the world without offering practical steps to address sanctions. During Raisi's years in power, Iran's economy re-emerged from a 2018-19 slump caused by the 2018 reimposition of sanctions, and growth peaked at 5.7% for the year ending in March, according to Iran's Statistical Center. Yet most of this expansion was driven by the energy sector, as the country experienced a 70% rise in oil output, now running at about 3.5 million barrels per day, with oil exports exceeding 1.4 million barrels per day and mainly going to China. Without hydrocarbons, Iran's growth last year would have been just 3.4%, and its trade balance would have hit a deficit of $16.8 billion, according to Mohammad Rezvanifa, the head of the Iranian Customs Service. Foreign direct investment has also stalled at $1.5 billion in 2022, according to UNCTAD. You are watching the international news on Atlantic Television Network. We will be back after this break.
Every day, our lives are changed by history.
We are one.
Leaders, politics,
Nobody's ambition is what the blood.
I have fought a very
natural occurrence, war, and the world economy. ATN covers Indian politics.
People into the country illegally. That is amazing.
Honorable
You human trafficker.
Honorable They are not picking our calls.
So no agreement with the EU, but
from the line across the ocean to the land beyond the mountains. Through the Sahara, we bring on-the-spot news, live analysis, expert discussions on trending stories in politics, business, socio-economy, sports, and documentaries. So catch all the updates on the happenings around the globe. Stay focused on the fact today, only on ATN.
Welcome back. This is the International News on Atlantic Television Network. Now to the rest of our stories. Mark Rutte, chosen to be NATO's next Secretary General, is a fierce critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin and a staunch ally of Ukraine who honed his skills as a political deal-maker during nearly 14 years as Dutch Prime Minister. Rutte, 57, has been one of the driving forces behind Europe's military support for Ukraine since Russia's 2022 invasion and says defeat on the battlefield for Moscow is vital to secure peace in Europe. His view is heavily influenced by the downing of an airliner over Ukraine in 2014, which the Netherlands blames on Russia and in which 196 of the 298 victims were Dutch. NATO must be powerful to counter the European Union leaders must not be naive about Putin's Russia, he says. He won't stop at Ukraine if we don't stop him now. This war is bigger than Ukraine itself. It is about upholding the international rule of law. Rutte told the United Nations in September 2022, 7 months after Russia's full-scale invasion. Rutte first took office in 2010 and went on to become the longest-serving Prime Minister before announcing last year that he planned to leave national politics. After the downing of flight MH17, he went from being primarily domestically focused to one of the EU's main deal-makers, playing an important role in European debates on immigration, debt, and the response to COVID-19. Under his leadership, the Netherlands has increased defense spending to more than the 2% threshold of GDP required of NATO members, providing F-16 fighter jets, artillery drones, and ammunition to Kyiv, and investing heavily in its own military. Under Stoltenberg, who joined a few months after Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, the alliance has added Montenegro, North Macedonia, Finland, and Sweden as new members. Some of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had hoped Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas would become the first woman to lead NATO, but others saw her as too hawkish towards Russia. A shaving-headed Evan Gershkovich went on trial behind closed doors on Wednesday in a Russian court where the U.S. journalist is facing accusations of espionage. Prosecutors say the reporter gathered secret information on the orders of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency about a company that manufactures tanks for Russia's war in Ukraine. If convicted, he faces a sentence of up to 20 years. Gershkovich, his newspaper, and the U.S. government all reject the allegations and say that he was just doing his job as a reporter accredited by Russia's foreign ministry to work there. His case is not about evidence, procedural norms, or the rule of law. It is about the Kremlin using American citizens to achieve its political objectives, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow said in a statement calling for Gershkovich's immediate release. After several hours of closed proceedings, the court said the next session would take place on August 13, an indication the case will drag on for months. The reason for the long interval was not clear. Journalists were briefly allowed to film the 32-year-old Gershkovich before the start of the trial, from which the media are barred. Wearing an open-necked shirt and standing in a glass box, he smiled faintly and nodded at colleagues he recognized. Prosecutor Mikhail Ozdoev later summarized the charges for reporters. The investigation established and documented that Gershkovich, on instructions from the CIA in 1973, in the Sverdlovsk region, collected secret information about the activities of defense enterprise regarding the production and repair of military equipment. Ozdoev said Gershkovich carried out the illegal actions while observing painstaking conspiratorial measures, he added. Osdayev later told reporters he had misspoken and the alleged offense was actually in March 2023, the month of the reporter's arrest. Pope Francis spoke out on Wednesday against the legalization of drugs and denounced drug traffickers as assassins, while also calling for help and support for addicts. A reduction in drug addiction is not achieved by liberalizing drug use. This is an illusion, as has been proposed or already implemented in some countries, Francis told crowds in St. Peter's Square at his weekly audience. At the same time, however, let us remember that each addict has a unique personal story and must be listened to, understood, loved, and, insofar as possible, healed and purified, he said on what the United Nations has designed as World Drug Day. Francis, 87, drew no distinction between so-called soft drugs, such as marijuana, which has been legalized for recreational use in several countries, and some United States, and some U.S. states, and hard ones such as heroin and cocaine. We cannot ignore the evil intentions and actions of drug dealers and traffickers. They are assassins, the Pope added. Francis, who is from Argentina, also condemned the destructive impact of drug production on the environment, saying it was increasingly evident, for example, in the Amazon basin in Latin America. Russia and Ukraine each handed back 90 prisoners of war on Tuesday in the latest of several periodic swaps in their 28-month-old conflict, with the United Arab Emirates overseeing the exchange as an intermediary. The last exchange took place on May 31st, when each side handed over 75 prisoners of war, also with the UAE acting as a go-between. That was the first exchange in nearly 4 months. Russia said prisoners brought home on Tuesday had faced mortal danger in captivity. Ukraine said returnees had included soldiers who had defended the Azovstal steel mill in a 3-month siege in 2022 and others taken prisoner when Russian forces briefly seized the defunct Chernobyl nuclear power station. The UAE said its actions as a go-between had been made possible by maintaining good contacts with both sides. The Russian Defense Ministry, in a posting on Telegram messaging app, said as a result of negotiations, 90 Russian prisoners of war who risked death in captivity are being returned from areas under Kyiv's control. It said the Russian prisoners were able to return home, with the United Arab Emirates participating as an intermediary in a humanitarian capacity. The freed Russian prisoners were being flown to Moscow, where they would undergo medical checks, the ministry said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said most of the freed servicemen were privates and surgeons, and the swap was another step in the process of bringing all detainees home. We will return all others in the same way, he said in his nightly video address. We are seeking the truth about everyone, where a person is, in what condition, what is needed for their return. He thanked the UAE for facilitating the exchange and pledged to press on with efforts to bring home those still being held. Ukraine's Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights, Dmitry Libinets, said those returning from captivity would undergo medical checks and receive help in resuming their lives. A video posted on the president's Telegram channel showed men stepping off a bus to be greeted and handed blue and yellow national flags to drape over their shoulders. The UAE Foreign Ministry, in a statement quoted by the state news agency, said mediation had proved successful because it had leveraged its distinct ties and partnership with both sides, including as a reliable mediator among both parties. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives suffered a further fall in support after 5 party officials, including 2 candidates, were being investigated over bets on the timing on an early election, according to a new poll. The scandal is undermining the Conservatives' efforts to close the gap on the opposition Labour Party's large poll leads 8 days before the national election. The expanding number of Conservative officials under investigation has resulted in support for the party falling to 18%, down to 2 percentage points, the poll survey published on Wednesday showed. The Labour Party was on 41% since the betting allegations first emerged. The conduct of government has become the second most important issue for voters, behind the cost of living crisis, the poll found. The betting scandal intensified further late on Tuesday after a cabinet minister said he had placed 3 bets on the date for the election. but that he was not being investigated by the gambling regulator. A Labour candidate also admitted placing a bet against himself. Both the Conservatives and Labour on Tuesday withdrew support for candidates under investigation. Sunak had faced days of criticism for initially failing to suspend the candidates being investigated by the regulator. While Sunak said he was extremely angry about the scandal, he previously stopped short of withdrawing support so the investigations would finish before any action was taken. Mel Stride, the Work and Pensions Minister, said on Wednesday that more candidates could be involved in the scandal and there should be a debate about political betting. For the poll, Survation interviewed 1,022 adults in Britain by phone between June 21st and 25th. Boeing's public relations crisis is now out of this world. The company's Starliner spacecraft and the 2 astronauts on board is currently stuck in space. After what started as an 8-day mission, U.S. astronauts Suni Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore have now spent the better part of a month on their space capsule attached to the International Space Station as engineers work out the problem with Starliner. It remains unclear when exactly the astronauts will be able to make their return to Earth. A Boeing spokesperson told the press they have adjusted the return of Starliner crew flight tests until after 2 planned spacewalks on Monday, June 24th and Tuesday, July 2nd, and that they currently do not have a date for the return and will evaluate opportunities after the spacewalks. The spokesperson also noted the crew is not pressed for time to leave the station since there are plenty of supplies in orbit and the station's schedule is relatively open through mid-August. The Starliner blasted into space on 5th June from Florida's Cape Canaveral Space Force Station after 2 previously unsuccessful launches on 6th May and 1st June respectively. A year behind schedule and $1.5 billion over budget, this particular NASA Boeing mission had problems long before its official launch, including issues with reaction control thrusters and helium leaks. The Boeing spokesperson noted that the helium leaks and most of the thruster problems have been all stable and not a concern for the return mission. Joe Biden has moved to correct a great injustice by pardoning thousands of U.S. veterans convicted over 6 decades under a military law that banned gay sex. The presidential proclamation, which comes during Pride Month and an election year, allows LGBTQ+ service members convicted of crimes based solely on their sexual orientation to apply for a certificate of pardon that will help them receive withheld benefits. Today I am righting an historic wrong by using my clemency authority to pardon many former service members who were convicted simply for being themselves, Biden said in a statement. Despite their courage and great sacrifice, thousands of LGBTQ+ service members were forced out of the military because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Some of these patriotic Americans were subject to court-martial and have carried the burden of this great injustice for decades. The president said the step was about dignity and decency and ensuring the military's culture reflects that of America. It grants clemency to service members convicted under Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 125, which criminalized sodomy, including between consenting adults, between 1951 and 2013, when it was rewritten by Congress. An online gamer from New Jersey recently flew to Florida, broke into the home of a fellow player with whom he had feuded digitally but never met in person, and tried to beat him to death with a hammer, according to authorities. These allegations, leveled by the Nassau County, Florida Sheriff's Office against 20-year-old Edward Kang, constitute an extreme example of a phenomenon that academics call internet banging, which involves online arguments, often between young people, that escalate into physical violence. As Bill Leeper, the local sheriff, told it, Kang and the man he is suspected of attacking became familiar with each other, playing the massively multiplayer online role-playing game ArcAge. The Korean game is supposed to no longer be available beginning Thursday. Its publisher announced in April, citing a declining number of active players, as press reported. But prior to the cancellation, Kang and the other player became locked in some sort of online altercation. Leeper said at a news briefing on Monday. Kang then informed his family that he was headed out of town to meet a friend he had made through gaming, Leeper recounted. The sheriff said Kang flew from Newark, New Jersey to Jacksonville, Florida, and booked himself into a hotel near his fellow gamer's home early Friday morning. He had allegedly bought a hammer and a flashlight at a local hardware store, receipts for which deputies later found in Kang's hotel room. By early Sunday, Kang purportedly had put on black clothes, gloves, and a mask, and he went into his target's home through an unlocked door. He waited for the victim to get up and take a bathroom break from gaming, and then battered him with the hammer, Leeper said. The alleged victim managed to wrestle Kang to the ground while screaming for help. The victim's stepfather woke up after hearing the screams, rushed to his stepson's side, and helped take Kang's hammer away and restrained him until deputies were called, and they arrived, according to Leeper. Deputies found blood at the home's entrance and in the bedroom of the victim, Leeper added. The sheriff said the victim was brought to a hospital to be treated for severe head wounds, while deputies jailed Kang on counts of attempted second-degree murder and armed burglary. Leeper accused Kang of telling deputies that he carried out the violent home invasion because he believed the target to be a bad person online. Kang also allegedly asked investigators how much prison time was associated with the breaking and entering, as well as assault. Julian Assange has landed in Australia and has been reunited with family after accepting a plea deal that brought his 14-year legal saga to an end. The WikiLeaks founder left a U.S. court in the U.S. Pacific Island territory of Saipan, a free man, on Wednesday after pleading guilty to a single criminal count of conspiring to obtain and disclose classified defense documents. He was sentenced to time already served in Belmont Prison in London. His release ends a legal saga that spanned more than a decade, in which Assange spent 5 years in the high-security jail and 7 years at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, battling extradition to the U.S., where he faced 18 criminal charges. If found guilty, he faced a sentence of up to 175 years in prison. Immediately after the 3-hour hearing, the U.S. government withdrew its extradition request from the UK, dropped all remaining charges pending in the U.S., and banned Assange from returning to the U.S. without permission. Assange headed straight to the airport and arrived in Canberra on Wednesday evening local time. Assange traveled to Australia aboard a private chartered Bombardier jet with his legal team, the ambassador to the UK, Kevin Rudd, and the UK High Commissioner, Stephen Smith. Supporters and family members, including his father, John Shipton, and wife, Stella Assange, gathered in Canberra to welcome him home. WikiLeaks has said it will hold a press conference on Wednesday night. Shipton told media at Parliament House that he hopes Assange does normal things after he gets back. It will be the first time Assange has met his 2 sons he has with his wife outside prison. Posting on X, Stella Assange asked supporters for help covering the massive USD 520,000 debt to the Australian government for the chartered flight he was not allowed to fly on commercial airlines to Saipan onward to Australia. In Parliament on Wednesday, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said Australians would have different views about the plea deal, but overwhelmingly would support his release. And that's the international news for today. Before we